Okay, so TikTok has been under scrutiny in the US lately, a scrutiny that could potentially ban the popular app across the continental United States.
The US government is moving one step closer to getting rid of TikTok for good.
The yays are 352, the nays are 65.
Now it goes to the Senate, where it will likely face a tougher road.
Well, tonight TikTok is fighting back after the House passed a bill calling for it to be banned in the U.S. unless it cuts ties with China.
This TikTok ban is the latest proof of the obvious tension between superpowers US and China that begs the question, why does the US hate China so much? By the end of this video, we will be answering some important questions far beyond the TikTok ban. Is the US threatened? Is China going to retaliate? How is the world reacting? And most importantly, could this lead to World War III? I am Louis Lapat. I make videos about history to make sense of what's happening in our world today. In today's episode of the Stay Curious series, we will unravel why the US hates China. Our story begins with this photo. At first glance, this picture seems to be a typical portrait. Take a closer look and you will realize that family members were not in the same room. Nah, consider this as a precursor of Photoshop. Notice how members were removed from different photos and added in. Sadly, this substitute family photo is the only way the Low family could be reunited after strict immigration rules prevented the Low family to be reunited in the United States. From 1882 to 1965, or for 43 long years, this has been the reality for the majority of Chinese Americans. Sadly, this anti-Chinese sentiment seems to have survived in the US until today. This photo is where we begin to satisfy the elephant in the room. Why is the US so afraid of China? I found this incredible survey by the Pew Research Center in 2021. Americans' negative vibes about China have spiked since 2018. Now, a whopping 67% of folks in the US give China the cold shoulder, scoring it less than 50 on its feeling thermometer from 0 to 100. That's a major shift. Interestingly, there are those who view China in a favorable light.
There are human rights issues in China. However, there are also huge human rights issues in the US. We can't simply judge and force China into making needed changes when internally the US is doing a terrible job.
But there are really those who are cold.
China is a communist country that doesn't believe in civil rights for their people. Their goal is global domination. They rule by brute force.
But here's the catch. Pew Research Center found that Americans rarely touch on the Chinese people or the country's history in judging how they feel about China. Instead, their focus was mainly on the Chinese government, its policies, international behavior, and the economy. While that is true today, that is not the reality 2 centuries ago. Back in the 1800s, everyone was talking about California because of one thing: gold. People from all over rushed to California in search of fortune. Among those who flocked to California are the Cantonese Chinese immigrants. War, famine, and economic hardship in southeastern China drove many Chinese men to immigrate to America. And during that time, around 24,000 young Chinese men arrived in California between 1849 and 1853. Of course, their presence invited trouble, and initial anti-Chinese sentiments arose from white miners. They resented Chinese miners and companies, feeling that they were taking American gold that belonged to them. This hindered economic opportunities, limiting Chinese miners to only working on sites deserted by white miners. A hefty monthly tax, violent attacks in mining camps with zero legal protection. In short, a piece of hell on earth. Take this detergent ad as an example. It's Uncle Sam kicking a Chinese. The Chinese must go, it said. It's racist text banners. We have no use for them since we got this wonderful washer. Despite challenges, Chinese immigrants in the gold rush era mined gold, started businesses, and formed San Francisco's Chinatown, the largest in the US. After the gold rush, Chinese immigrants took on farm labor, low-wage industrial work, and railroad construction. With California's population blooming, the need for improved transportation to connect it to the West grew, thus gave birth to the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, a monumental project aimed to connect the eastern and western parts of the United States. Chinese immigrants in California during that gold rush helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, tackling the tough job of constructing it across the challenging terrain of the American West. Despite lower pay, Chinese workers took on hazardous tasks and longer shifts. This is the famous photograph of the completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 in Utah. There are workers and bosses, politicians and businessmen, but one group is conspicuously absent. Despite being heavily involved in its construction, along with other immigrants, no single Chinese can be found in this photograph. But the worst is yet to come, because in 1882, for the first time in American history, a group of people was banned in the continental United States solely on the basis of race. That year, the Chinese Exclusion Act, signed by US President Chester Arthur, closed the door on all Chinese laborers to enter into the United States during that period. Blaming Chinese workers for economic issues, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to meet worker demands and uphold white racial purity. And Chinese Americans challenged the discriminatory act's constitutionality, but their efforts proved unsuccessful. After the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act came the 1892 Jerry Act, making life tougher for Chinese Americans. They had to carry special papers or risk deportation. Though some fought against it, the law remained, making things even harder. Immigrants found without certificates faced hard labor and deportation. Bail was only possible if a credible white witness vouched for them. Now, while the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is often called the first big immigration restriction in the US, there is an earlier law that's not as well known, the Page Act of 1875. This law stopped many Chinese women from coming to the United States. Under the Page Act, Chinese women at Angel Island Immigration Station endured invasive and humiliating interrogations by US immigration officials. Poems on the walls depicted the medical exams as barbarous, humiliating, and discriminatory. The Chinese Exclusion Acts remained in effect for 61 years until 1943, when they were repealed solely to boost the morale of a wartime ally during World War II. During this period, the Low family isn't alone in settling for cutouts for their family photo. America's exclusion era unfolds the story of Wong Kim Ark. Born to Chinese parents in San Francisco, California in 1873, Wong became the face of the birthright provision of the 14th Amendment that is well settled in the US today. His father, a merchant in Sacramento Street, took the family back to China due to declining business. However, Wang, dissatisfied with his prospects there, returned to California years later to work as a cook. In 1894, Wang journeyed to China for a temporary visit, carrying what he believed to be all the necessary documentation for his return to California. A year after he went back to America, this is when his problem began. He wasn't allowed to get off. Instead, he was kept on the ship by someone named John Weiss, who didn't want Chinese people to come to America. Thankfully, the 6 companies, a group in San Francisco helping Chinese immigrants, stepped in when Wang was trapped on a ship in the bay. Their lawyers filed a special request called the writ of habeas corpus, arguing that Wang, as a U.S. citizen, shouldn't be held against his will. The U.S. Solicitor General Holmes Conrad disagreed and appealed to the Supreme Court. He argued that Wang wasn't a U.S. citizen because his parents were Chinese subjects. In the landmark case of United States v. Wong Kim Ark, Justice Horace Gray, writing for the majority, ruled that Wang was indeed a natural-born citizen of the United States because he was born on U.S. soil, regardless of his parents' origins. In legal parlance, this is called jus soli, as enshrined in the 14th Amendment, which means that if you are born in the soil of a particular country, you are automatically considered a citizen of that country. Now, discriminatory acts against the Chinese communities piled after the other. The Chinese Massacre in 1871 in Los Angeles, 20 Chinese immigrants killed. The Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming in 1885, 26 killed. Almost 200 years later, the shadows of the past still haunt America. Apparently, though, America is not alone. Many around the world see China's growing influence as a major threat. In fact, in 2018, around half or more in countries like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and the US believe China's power was a significant concern. This sentiment was widespread, with almost half or more in every country except Tunisia viewing China's influence as a potential threat. Well, I'd like to frame it as this: the bullied decided it can't be bullied anymore. China's military, the People's Liberation Army, is the world's largest with 2.8 million members. Under Xi's leadership since 2013, it has achieved remarkable milestones, expanding the Navy to become the largest globally, enhancing nuclear capabilities, and restructuring the chain of command to report directly to Xi Jinping as the chairman of the Central Military Commission. Let's go back to the question, but let's frame the answer using the modern context. Why is the US so afraid of China? To answer this, it's important to discuss the Thucydides trap. It can be explained in this wise. When a rising power challenges an established one, it often leads to conflict as each seeks dominance. This can escalate due to tensions and misunderstandings, sometimes resulting in war, despite neither side desiring it. A classic example to this would be the conflict between Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. The two are deemed as rivals during that time. Athens was a rising power with its naval strength, democracy, and wealth, while Sparta dominated through militarism and disciplined armies. Through time, tension grew. Athens formed the Delian League, expanding its influence and wealth. Sparta, on the other hand, and viewing Athens as a threat, created the Peloponnesian League to counter it. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BCE, lasting nearly 3 decades with battles and shifting alliances. It ended in 404 BCE with Sparta defeating Athens. Greek historian Thucydides, in his writings on the Peloponnesian War, highlighted the role of fear and power dynamics in precipitating the conflict. He famously stated, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable." The challenge now is for the US and China to escape the Thucydides trap. This would require both the United States and China to navigate the relationship with careful diplomacy, effective communication, and a willingness to find mutually beneficial solutions to their differences. Today, Asia has become a key battleground for Sino-American rivalry once more. Its proximity to China's mainland makes it a prime target for Xi Jinping's push to increase Chinese influence and power. The world can't help but just watch on the sidelines as the rivalry between China and the United States continues to grow. And here's hoping that this growing animosity won't escalate much and give us World War III. What do you think? Is the competition between the US and China not healthy anymore? Let me know in the comment section below. For the meantime, let's shift to South Korea's soft power and how it uses its military influence to conquer the world. You can watch it right here.